A sitting president sailed home to America on this company's flagship. A movie star sailed away on that same ship to marry a prince. 65 friends aboard, 20,000 people waiting on the other side. Its liners were the backdrop for one of Hollywood's most famous romances. This wasn't a cruise novelty. This was America's largest shipping line on the Mediterranean, big enough that billion-dollar rivals fought over its scraps. Decades later, that ship sat beached on a mudflat in India, cracked in half, cut apart by hand. Everyone says jets killed it. That's not wrong. It's just too small. Here's the thing about that explanation. It's not false. Jets really did end the age of the ocean liner, and how fast that happened is genuinely shocking. But jets killed the ocean liner only explains why passengers stopped booking staterooms. It doesn't explain why a company with a huge subsidized cargo business and decades of infrastructure still ended up in bankruptcy court more than a decade after the last passenger switched to flying. Airlines took the passengers. Something else took the company. And that something else was baked into the business from the beginning, quietly, while the money was still coming in. To understand it, you have to go back to 1919 to a company that had nothing to do with glamour at all. It started as the Export Steamship Corporation, a New York outfit buying up surplus World War I freighters. Instead of chasing the crowded, prestigious run to Britain and Northern Europe, the founders pointed their ships somewhere almost nobody was fighting over: the Mediterranean. Gibraltar, Naples, Genoa, ports across the Levant and North Africa, places the big passenger lines treated as an afterthought. It wasn't glamorous, it was smart. While Cunard and the French line fought over the North Atlantic with their floating palaces, this company quietly built a monopoly nobody else wanted badly enough to contest. By the late 1920s, that monopoly had a name people recognized: American Export Lines. It had the largest privately owned American flag fleet on the North Atlantic and a 10-year government mail contract. Cunard, the French line, the Italian line, they were all still throwing their biggest ships and biggest money at Britain and Northern Europe. Almost nobody wanted to bother matching a mid-sized American company on a Mediterranean route that carried less prestige. That's exactly why it worked. In 1929 and 1930, the company launched 4 combination ships, the 4 Aces, that carried both cargo and passengers on the same voyage. So it never had to choose between the boring business and the exciting one. 3 of those original 4 ships would later be lost as troop transports during the Second World War, a reminder that this company's history was tangled up in the biggest events of the century and kept surviving them one after another until it finally couldn't. Here's where you need to reframe what this company actually was, because the title makes you think it's a glamour cruise story. It wasn't. Not really. American Export Lines was, underneath everything, a subsidized cargo carrier that happened to also carry passengers. The passenger side made headlines. The cargo side made the company's actual money and carried its actual risk. That distinction is going to matter later, because when the passenger glamour disappeared, most people assumed the company disappeared with it. It didn't. It kept limping along on the cargo side for another 20 years, quietly, until the same structural weakness caught up with that side of the business too. But first, the good years, because you need to feel why this company looked unbeatable before you can understand how it fell. In 1951, American Export launched twin liners that were, for a moment, the pride of the American merchant marine, the Independence and the Constitution. Fully air-conditioned, fast, modern, built to make the old idea of ocean travel feel new again. They ran what the company branded the Sun Lane route: New York to Gibraltar to Cannes to Genoa to Naples, and for a stretch of the 1950s, riding one of these ships was not just transportation, it was an event. In April of 1956, Grace Kelly boarded the Constitution in New York with 65 family and friends, sailing to Monaco to marry Prince Rainier, 20,000 people waiting on the other end. 2 years earlier, President Truman had crossed home on the same ship. Cary Grant and Deborah Kerr filmed one of the most beloved romantic dramas in Hollywood history aboard that same ocean liner World. This was a company that had convinced America that crossing an ocean could be dignified, even thrilling, at a moment when flying across the Atlantic was still rare, expensive, and a little terrifying for most people. Watch what was happening underneath that glamour, though. The company was leaning harder and harder into fixed, permanent, enormously expensive infrastructure, 2 massive liners, union crews, government operating subsidies that made American flag shipping possible at all, because paying American wages to compete against foreign flagged ships running on foreign wages was, on its own, a losing math problem. The subsidy wasn't a bonus on top of the business. It was the floor the whole business stood on, which meant the company wasn't really competing on the open market. It was competing inside a market the government had agreed to keep artificially survivable. That kept an entire American industry alive for decades. But it also meant the company's real customer wasn't just the passenger buying a ticket. It was Washington, agreeing every year to keep footing part of the bill and quietly reserving the right to stop. That's the kind of detail that sounds like a footnote. It is not a footnote. Hold on to it, because here's what was coming for the entire ocean liner business, and the scale of it is almost unbelievable. In October of 1958, within weeks of each other, BOAC flew a Comet jet across the Atlantic, and Pan Am flew a Boeing 707. Within 6 months, airlines had roughly 2/3 of all transatlantic traffic. Within 5 years, 95 to 98% of it. That's not decline. That's the near total collapse of an entire way of crossing an ocean in less time than it takes to finish a college degree. And here's the detail that should make you sit up. American Export Lines had actually run its own transatlantic airline decades earlier, flying seaplanes across the Atlantic in 1939 and 1940. The company that eventually got killed by aviation had once tried to be an aviation company itself. It just happened to be standing on the wrong side of the technology when the real jet age arrived. This wasn't just American export's problem. It hit every ocean liner company at once. Cunard, which had spent decades treating flying like a passing fad, watched its own transatlantic traffic collapse just as fast and eventually pulled out of year-round Atlantic passenger service entirely. American Export wasn't failing on its own. It was one ship in a fleet the entire industry was losing at the same time. So the obvious move, and the company made it, was to try to become something other than a way to cross an ocean. They repainted the liners white, rebranded the Sun Lane route as a cruise product, added staterooms and a solarium, trying to sell the voyage as a vacation instead of transportation. That sounds like adaptation. It bought a few years. It didn't fix the problem because the fixed costs, the crews, the fuel, the maintenance, the subsidized union wages, all of that stayed exactly the same size, whether the ship was crossing an ocean full of people who needed to get somewhere or floating in a circle for tourists on vacation. The business had gotten thinner. The overhead hadn't moved an inch. This is where people get the timeline wrong, and it's the part almost nobody tells. The public assumes the death blow was the jet age, sometime around 1958 to 1963. It wasn't. The real crack opened later, quietly, in 1965, years after everyone had already decided the passenger business was finished. That year, federal regulators blocked American Export's push to accelerate fleet modernization, right as the entire global shipping industry was being rebuilt around a new idea, the shipping container. Standardized steel boxes that could move off a ship and straight onto a truck or a train without ever being unpacked by hand. It sounds boring. It was the single biggest transformation in the history of cargo shipping, and it was happening while this company's request to modernize sat in a regulatory holding pattern. That same year, a dock strike hit the East Coast and knocked out the company's first quarter. One bad quarter shouldn't sink a company that had survived the Depression and 2 world wars, but it revealed something nobody had wanted to say out loud. There was no cushion left. None. A company built on thin, subsidized margins tied to fixed infrastructure it couldn't easily shrink had reached the point where a single labor disruption could knock the wind out of an entire fiscal year. The public saw new cruise paint jobs. The balance sheet saw a company borrowing time. And here's where the walls really start closing in, because this is not a story where one thing killed the company. It's a story where the company survived each individual blow and then discovered it had used up whatever it had left to survive the next one. Passenger revenue kept eroding because tourists sailing for fun instead of necessity is a much smaller market than an entire nation that needs to cross an ocean. Meanwhile, on the cargo side, where the real money had always lived, foreign competitors were building container-ready fleets, while American exports' newer ships were still designed around the old breakbulk method, loading and unloading crates by hand, one at a time. That's not a small disadvantage. That's the difference between a company that can turn a ship around in a day and one that needs a week. In shipping, time isn't just money. Time is the entire business model. Every extra day at dock was a day of paying crews, berth fees, and insurance, and earning nothing. The company kept restructuring, which sounds like action, but restructuring that often is usually a symptom, not a solution. It merged with the Isbranson Shipping Company in the early 1960s and took on a new name, American Export Isbranson Lines. It formed a holding company in 1967, unwound it, and reverted to its old name in 1973. 4 name changes in roughly a decade isn't a company finding its footing. It's a company rearranging the furniture because it can't afford to fix the foundation underneath it. On top of that, the company had taken on operation of the world's first nuclear-powered merchant ship, the Savannah. A genuinely remarkable piece of American engineering and a genuine financial anchor at the same time, costing roughly $2 million a year more to run than a conventional vessel. It photographed beautifully and bled quietly. A company chasing the prestige of being the future of shipping while its actual present-day business was already under siege from every direction at once. In 1971, Jakob Isbranson, the man who had taken over the company, resigned amid mounting losses. Losing your own chief executive mid-crisis is not a footnote. It's a signal to creditors, employees, and the government agencies deciding whether to keep subsidizing you that the people closest to the numbers had run out of ideas for fixing them. By 1974, the company was selling off the Staten Island Marine Terminal. It had operated for years, handing it to New York City. Companies don't sell working terminals when things are fine. They sell them when they need cash faster than the business can generate it. That's a company selling its own furniture to make rent. Every one of these pressures on its own is survivable. A dock strike is survivable. A regulatory delay is survivable. Losing an executive is survivable. Selling one property is survivable. Stack them one after another over roughly a decade on top of a business that never had real margin to begin with, and you don't get a crisis. You get an inevitability. In July of 1977, American Export Lines filed for bankruptcy. Filing for bankruptcy isn't the same as dying. It's a legal pause button, a chance to reorganize debt and find a way forward. For American Export, there was no way forward. In March of 1978, Farrell Lines absorbed the company's remaining ships and port operations, keeping some of the old ship names, a courtesy, or maybe just convenience. But American Export Lines, the company, the identity that had carried a president and a princess, was gone. The brand didn't get killed all at once. It got quietly folded into somebody else's fleet until there was nothing left to point to and call American Export. That distinction matters more than people give it credit for. Acquisition is not survival. Sometimes the logo lives on while the actual system underneath it is already dead. Farrell wasn't rescuing American Export Lines. Farrell was picking up the pieces. And this is the part that's almost too strange to be true. The two most famous ships in the company's history, the Independence and the Constitution, had already been quietly laid up years before any of this, back in 1968 and 1969, retired from the Mediterranean run because there simply weren't enough passengers left who wanted to cross an ocean by sea instead of air. They sat mostly idle for years, occasionally sold, occasionally rebranded, ghosts wearing new names. The Constitution made it to 1997, 46 years old, sold for scrap for just under $2 million, less than the price of a small hotel for a ship that once carried a sitting president. While under tow to the scrapyard, 700 nautical miles north of Hawaii, it sank. The Independence lasted even longer, and its final years read almost like a slow-motion disappearance. Laid up in San Francisco Bay for years, so long and so forgotten that in 2002 it struck the Carquinez Bridge while being towed to a reserve fleet, a ghost ship still bumping into things on its way to nowhere. In 2003, it was sold for $4 million. In 2008, it was towed out under the Golden Gate Bridge under a new name meant to disguise what it actually was, and sent to Alang, India, one of the largest shipbreaking operations on Earth, a place that scraps almost anything for steel. Alang turned it away in 2009. A scrapyard that exists specifically to tear apart old ships didn't want it. Eventually, it was beached on the mudflats at Gopnath, its hull cracked in two. Workers cut it apart by hand, piece by piece, through 2010, until the last ship built in America to carry ocean liner passengers across the Atlantic simply wasn't there anymore. Not sold. Not renamed. Gone. In the most literal sense, a ship can be gone. Somewhere in between the boardrooms and the bankruptcy filings and the scrapyards, there were real people whose lives were built around this company, and that's the part that doesn't show up in a shipping ledger. Dock workers in Hoboken and on Staten Island who showed up at the same hiring halls for years, their working rhythm built around ships coming and going on schedule week after week for decades. Seafarers who spent careers timing their lives around American Export's sailing calendar, suddenly needing somewhere else to go once that calendar disappeared in 1978. Students at Stevens Institute of Technology who, for a few strange years, actually lived aboard one of the old Four Aces ships, repurposed as a floating dormitory, sleeping in cabins that had once carried transatlantic passengers. Cadets at a Texas Maritime Academy trained for decades aboard a former American export liner without most of them ever knowing its old name. A refund check is not the same thing as a way to cross an ocean. When a route disappears, it's not just a line item on a balance sheet. It's a family that can no longer visit relatives the way they used to. It's a worker who loses a job tied to a schedule that no longer exists. For decades, American Export Lines was one of the ways ordinary Americans, not just presidents and movie stars, reached family, opportunity, and each other across an ocean. When it went quiet, that option went quiet with it. What this story actually shows isn't really about one shipping company. It's about what happens to an entire industry when the thing that makes it possible, subsidy, protection, government-backed survival, quietly stops being enough to compensate for a changing world. American Export Lines wasn't uniquely mismanaged. By 1970, the entire American flag merchant fleet was in trouble. Hundreds of ships, most of them decades old, all riding the same dying system at once. This company didn't fail because nobody wanted to ship cargo across an ocean, or because nobody wanted to travel. It failed because it could no longer afford to be the company doing it in a country that had decided quietly, year after year, not to keep paying what it cost to keep an industry like this one alive. If you ever sailed on the Independence or the Constitution, if your family crossed the Atlantic on one of those ships for a wedding, a homecoming, or a trip nobody in your family ever forgot, if you worked those piers in Hoboken or on Staten Island, if you lived aboard the Stevens dormitory ship or trained on that old Texas Clipper without knowing what it used to be, put it in the comments. For a company like this one, the comment section really might be the last archive that's left. A ship once carried a president home, and a princess away to be married, with 20,000 people cheering on the other side of an ocean. Decades later, that same steel sat cracked open on a mud flat in India, cut apart by hand until there was nothing left to call it. The water is still there. The ship isn't.